Hello and good morning, everybody. It's me, Julian. As you can see, I am still on my camping trip. I've currently swung by Mount Shasta in California, and I'm now at Shasta College. And this is going to be the Monday morning live introduction to philosophy and theory session. I hope that you can hear me okay. There's a little water trickling in the background and perhaps some construction noises in the back, but hopefully you can hear me just fine. This is going to be a 30-minute session titled Enjoyment as a Political Category, in which I'm going to talk a little bit more about the psychoanalytic take on enjoyment, specifically focusing on Žižek's interpretation of the obscene master, with an additional emphasis on the Adornian concept of fetishistic desublimation, as well as just some more general arguments and definitions when it comes to thinking psychoanalytically about the superego and its political applications, as it were. All that and more coming up in the next 30 minutes or so. Of course, a huge thank you to the patrons who continue to make these sessions possible in the first place. And if you'd like to become a patron, you can also download my lectures as audio files, as well as my recurring ebook series. Thank you so much, and let's simply launch right in. So the title of this lecture is Enjoyment as a Political Category. And I was reading a text by Slavoj Žižek recently where he points out that it's actually Etienne Balibar, one of the post-Althuserians, who makes the argument that there are really two ways in which you can approach psychoanalysis and politics. Either you have the vulgar application of psychoanalysis to politics, for example, trying to explain the trauma that lies behind a political leader's ineptitude or something like this. Was Trump mistreated by his father in his youth and therefore now he's such a bigot, etc.? Or you have, and this is what Balibar himself advocates, an inquiry into what you might call the political within psychoanalysis as such. So what is the political within psychoanalysis? Well, arguably it relates to the superego. In fact, from a traditional Freudian perspective, what happens is that we have a division between the id, which is your base desires, your drive towards pleasure, as it were, versus your superego. And the superego injunction is what supposedly civilizes the subject. This is what Freud refers to as sublimation. This is essentially a Hegelian category, which is to say the subject, the ego, becomes the vanishing mediator for the sublation of the id, which is the site of pure drives, into the higher category of the superego, which facilitates participation within the symbolic order, which therefore facilitates civic life. If you weren't listening to your superego, we would all simply regress back to being animals. However, Adorno is perhaps one of the first thinkers, Adorno a key member of the Frankfurt School, to essentially argue that what occurs within capitalism is not so much sublimation of the id into superego, but rather its inverse, which is to say the capitalist imperative is how the superego injunction, it comes in the very guise of the id, which is to say, after the death of God, after the death of ideology, life simply exists so that you can enjoy, so that you can live your best possible and most happy life. So go out there, experience life, and enjoy yourself, like every car advertisement you see on TV. And this is what Adorno calls fetishistic desublimation. So instead of the sublimation by which the id is sublimated into the superego, thereby creating the symbolic horizon against which the ego can participate in society and recognize itself, Adorno argues that what occurs within capitalism is fetishistic desublimation, namely desublimation of the superego as id, which therefore attaches onto the fetishistic object of enjoyment, namely that which gives you pleasure. And of course, what is it that signifies enjoyment within the capitalist framework? It is the commodity. Therefore, the commodity becomes the object of fetishistic enjoyment, which therefore acts as a desublimation of the superego as id. To put it more simply, Adorno's basic argument is that within capitalism, we are listening or following our superego at the exact moment at which we appear to be giving in to our desires, appear to be giving in to our pleasure. And this leads to a certain cynicism. The cynical stance is essentially to say, if the only meaning that life has is to enjoy, then even if we don't believe in the powers that be, even if we don't approve of them, we have to necessarily uphold them so as to guarantee the horizon against which our enjoyment can take place. Think about a contemporary capitalist subject like you or me. We all know how rotten at its core capitalism is, and yet we nevertheless continue to participate in it because we cannot imagine existing beyond it. We cannot imagine a world that exists beyond the horizon of capitalism. Like Frederick Jameson famously said, it has become easier to imagine the end of the world than it has become to imagine the end of capitalism. This is because the reason that we exist is to enjoy, and capitalism is what guarantees the horizon against which enjoyment, as we know it, is accessible to us. Therefore, any act of revolution isn't simply an act against capitalism or the institutions that guarantee capitalist functioning, but instead a reimagining of how enjoyment might occur. In other words, we have to teach ourselves to enjoy in a different way, to understand what actually gives us enjoyment or pleasure. Because the paradox of fetishistic desublimation is that this imperative, enjoy yourself, doesn't actually make us happy, doesn't actually make us fulfilled. It makes us less happy, it makes us more depressed. Hence why Žižek's basic argument, as I've said before, is that more permissive societies actually lead to unhappier subjects. People who don't have a purpose, who don't have something to live for, no higher calling or purpose. If the highest imperative is to enjoy yourself, to signal that you are happy to other unhappy subjects, then this enjoyment becomes itself an obligation, itself a duty. Not an after effect of a duty, but itself a duty. And here we have an important distinction, I think, between the Kantian ethic and the capitalist ethic. The Kantian ethic, du kannst denn du sollst, is I have no power to change anything, and this is precisely why I must act and fulfill my duty. Whereas the capitalist ethic, the cynical one, is I have every power, I am an all-powerful being, and yet why bother, because it doesn't matter anyway, nothing will change. And this seems like a little different, but it's actually all important. The Kantian position of impotence isn't cynical. In fact, it's the exact opposite. It's that you have to act as soon as you realize that you are completely powerless, that there's nothing that you could really do. And this is precisely why you have as the ultimate ethical act to nevertheless fight, to nevertheless get up and do something. Whereas the capitalist model is you are all powerful, you are all free, you can do whatever you want, and yet this is exactly what induces paralysis. This is exactly what induces impotence. It's a little bit like the Kierkegaardian maxim that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, which is to say, against the seemingly open horizon of pure possibility, you become paralyzed. You no longer have the courage to do anything. This leads to a certain cynicism, a cynicism in which you feel like you couldn't do anything, but what is it going to matter anyway? In fact, one of Žižek's arguments is that within contemporary capitalism, this very cynicism, which is the paradoxical stance of, I could do anything, but why bother? I am free, but I'm only nominally free, so why exert it? Means that we have a desire for a return to figures of parental authority who tell us what to do in our stead. For example, if you have a trainer tells you exactly how to work out and what to do. You don't have to think about it yourself. If you have McKinsey coming in as a consulting firm for your government, you don't have to worry about ideology or politics. You can simply do what the consultants tell you. If you go online and listen to Jordan Peterson, you don't have to worry about what's going to happen with your life. You can simply follow his 10 rules for life. This desire for parental authority for Žižek is therefore symptomatic of this very cynicism, this very paralysis of freedom that occurs within capitalism. Once again, a more permissive society in which commodities as the supposed objects of enjoyment against the horizon of fetishistic desublimation, therefore create this very stance by which we want to return to parental authority. Now, Žižek often likes to reference here Lacan's reading of Dostoevsky. In fact, Lacan is a pretty well-known inversion of the Dostoevskian maxim in The Brothers Karamazov: if God exists, then nothing is permitted. And Žižek says that it's the other way around. If God exists, then everything is permitted. And vice versa, as in The Brothers Karamazov, if God doesn't exist, then nothing is permitted. Now, I'm going to try to explain briefly how this works, because it can seem a little bit confusing. Usually we think that God is the figure of parental authority with prohibitions, so you can't be free, you can't enjoy yourself. However, from a strictly speaking Lacanian standpoint, enjoyment can only be accessed against the horizon of prohibition, which is to say, in a Hegelian sense, it's the prohibition which creates the very desire. It's the law which creates the free subject who has to assert himself against it. This isn't simply saying that there is a law and therefore you want to go against it. It's that the very law as prohibition creates the ethical horizon against which you have to try to decide whether this law is just or not. Which is to say, there's also a lot of background noise. I don't know if anybody can hear this. I can barely hear myself. Apologies if you can hear lots of construction going on. I'm going to rephrase this because I'm losing my train of thought because it's very chaotic here. I'm sorry, everybody. It's supposed to be idyllic here, but I'm right next to a construction site. Let's rephrase this for a moment. Let's ask a hypothetical question for a moment. What if God existed? What if God existed and we had verifiable evidence of the existence of God? From a Kantian perspective, the existence of God would actually eliminate the possibility of good. Which is to say, from a Kantian perspective, what it means to be good or evil, what it means to make an ethical judgment, is precisely that we don't know what God wants. We can't simply follow God as a parental authority telling us exactly what to do. Certainly we come close to it with the idea of the Ten Commandments, but even those can be subject to interpretation. Infamously, the Nazis argued that the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," was a Jewish conspiracy to protect the Jews. Here we already have the most debased version of the undermining of the Ten Commandments. And so the absence as to our knowledge of a godly authority is what creates the horizon against which a subject is free to decide how to act. In fact, I mentioned this recently in the most recent Planet of the Apes film, The Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. This is arguably the central position, which is to say, in the film, we start with the word of Caesar as the word of Christ or the word of God. Apes are free because they live after the event of the death of Caesar, the ape. This means that ape is nominally free. However, within the film, we start having symbolic master signifiers, structures of power that guarantee and signify the word of Caesar. For example, the leader of the Kingdom of the Apes, who says that he is the new Caesar. And against this backdrop, we have the ape in the film, the protagonist, who starts considering whether or not his actions that he believes to be ethical correspond to the rule of law in the guise of the word of Caesar. And the two figures in the film, in the Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, are on the one hand, the new king, who proclaims himself a new Caesar, figure of authority, versus the monk-like priest, the orangutan, who says that it is up to the individual subject to interpret the word of Caesar for himself. Here we have two different visions. On the one hand, we have the authoritarian figure who guarantees the symbolic horizon of enjoyment against which everyone can follow in the footsteps of Caesar, and the much more philosophically open and therefore treacherous idea that the word of Caesar is the opening up of a symbolic horizon against which the subject has to make his own decisions apropos good versus evil. And it is precisely this open-ended, abysmal stance of the orangutan that allows for true subjectivity. But this is a stance of pain. This is a stance of uncertainty. This is a stance of dissatisfaction. Because ultimately you have to look towards yourself. Whereas the stance of the king is precisely the one that allows for enjoyment. As long as you follow the king, you can live in this enjoyable society of apes, in which ape is triumphant. Therefore, once again, enjoyment is a political category. We uphold our masters, even if we don't believe in them, because against the backdrop of their symbolic certainty, we can continue to enjoy. Whereas to properly plunge into the ethical abyss of the subjective stance is to face anxiety, is to face hysteria, insecurity. Are my actions actually just? Are they justifiable? Therefore, the cynic is the one who says, it doesn't matter what I do, as long as I keep enjoying myself. And it's precisely the properly free subject, the one who is no longer nominally free, who has to assume the proper hysterical stance of why and how are my actions impacting others? What is the legitimacy of my actions as I formulate them? This means that, strictly speaking, if there were a God, to go back to the original question, if there were a God, and if there were an empirically proven hell, a place of eternal torment and punishment, this would have the paradoxical effect of rendering even a good act an evil one, which is to say any good act would now simply be an act of mere calculation. I'm doing something good because I know it will prevent me from going to hell. It will guarantee me a reward in the afterlife. Therefore, there is no longer any true freedom possible. There's no longer any true ethical act possible. Once again, the ethical is precisely that which interrupts or disturbs our enjoyment and forces us to make a choice, forces us to take a stance so that we might be able to be free. Whereas if everything is guaranteed, if good and evil is determined by a higher authority who will send you to a kind of afterlife jail, which is limbo, or into heaven for bliss, or hell for punishment, then this means that you are no longer really free. Even if you choose to act with compassion towards others, you're doing it out of self-calculation. It is no longer a selfless act. Therefore, you continue to exist essentially as an evil person. This means that one of the arguments that I'd like to make is that Freud's argument about beyond the pleasure principle, namely his argument about the superego and his argument about the drives, is related to the Kantian position of going beyond the ethical principle. Ethics as no longer simply acting good versus evil, but ethics as precisely the uncertainty as to how to act. Therefore, the ethical decision of the subject, what makes him most free, is precisely when he is confronted with a situation in which he feels like he has no choice, in which he feels like he has to act precisely because there is nothing that he can do, and no one else who will do it for him. Now, I'd like to revert back to Žižek's argument here. Žižek's argument is that, to put it very simply, is that permissiveness kills desire, and capitalism creates a permissive society in which the imperative is to enjoy yourself. However, it's precisely because the obstacle for such enjoyment disappears that enjoyment becomes barred from us. And here it's very important to note that Žižek's argument is not that we should reinstate paternal symbolic authority. This is absolutely crucial. He's not arguing that we should go back to a symbolic authority, God as Father, etc., so that we can live in certainty and so that we can access our enjoyment. He says, quote unquote, we cannot return to the authority of the law, but what we can do is act as if we sustain the law. Now, what's important here is this acting as if we sustain the law is the fetishistic stance par excellence. God is not dead, and yet I will continue to act as if he God is dead, but I will continue to act as if he exists. Capitalism is broken, but I will continue to act as if it works. Our political leaders are corrupt, but I will nevertheless continue to believe in the ideal of democracy, etc. What's important here is that the cynical stance is therefore the stance which guarantees enjoyment beyond the death of the belief in the ideal authority of the law. Which say the cynical stance is, I know very well that God is dead, but I will continue to believe. I know very well that the authorities are corrupt, but I will continue to participate on behalf of law and order. I know very well, but is therefore the cynical stance. And here Žižek makes a leap back to the French formula, je sais bien, mais quand même. I know very well, but nevertheless. Which is to say, the cynical stance is what upholds the symbolic framework of the superego authority so that the subject can continue to enjoy, thereby continuing to exist. And to threaten this symbolic horizon, this authority, thereby eliminates the horizon against which subjective enjoyment takes place, therefore becoming an existential threat to the subject. What makes it cynical, therefore, is that the subject essentially upholds the powers that be so as to create a stable point of reference to ease his own psychic tensions. And yet these are psychic tensions that are brought about by the very symbolic order that is upheld by the subject's deadlock. Hence this is a deadlock. We uphold the very society that makes us depressed, and yet if we refuse to uphold it, we become worse than depressed. We essentially destroy ourselves completely. And so we continue to participate. Now, what I'd like to conclude here with is Žižek says that this has some profound consequences. The consequences are the following. If we're supposed to enjoy ourselves as an imperative, but we're not able to do so because the permissive society kills desire, therefore making us depressed, then we start looking for figures who allow us to enjoy ourselves again, who give us the possibility of enjoyment. And this is where we have the most overt example of enjoyment as a political category, which is to say, figures like Donald Trump, which Žižek likens to the obscene master, which I can explain in a minute, essentially have as their main political platform enjoyment, a return to enjoyment, an excessive obscene enjoyment. And Žižek argues that this enjoyment as a political category in the guise of Donald Trump's politics, can be seen in the frame of the Lacanian imaginary, symbolic, and real. Imaginary enjoyment happens when you're trolling the libs or owning the libs. When you say something offensive, you take on a racist or some form of reactionary stance that is deliberately meant to cause outrage or sadness on behalf of the liberal other. And here many Republicans and alt-right figures will say, well, I don't really believe that I hate black people, but it gives me pleasure when liberals become upset about this. In the same way that bumper sticker cars in America will say things that are meant to create frustration amongst liberal drivers. This is enjoyment on the level of the imaginary. You're enjoying the supposed pain that your outrageous stance is causing in the imaginary other, in the liberal other. The exemplary slogan of this is the idea of liberal tears, that what you are doing is creating these tears. And here we have, if you will, a form of schadenfreude. However, what's important is that schadenfreude is when you take or derive enjoyment from the other's pain in an objective or neutral fashion. Whereas the imaginary level of enjoyment, when it comes to liberal tears, is totally detached from the actual reality of those tears, which is to say you don't have to observe a liberal crying in order to have the satisfaction. The satisfaction is sustained by the very idea that your outrageous political stance could cause frustration on behalf of the symbolic other, of the liberal authority, who you also imagine to secretly govern society. This is then followed by the symbolic level of enjoyment. And the symbolic level of enjoyment can be seen in the slogan, drain the swamp. The draining of the swamp is enjoyment on the level of the symbolic, the retaking of institutions so as to drain them of their toxic influences, the fight against the deep state, etc. And this can even be rhetorical. Like when Trump first entered into the White House, he was quite vocal about saying that it was a dump, that it wasn't up to his standards. And here we have again the symbolic meeting the imaginary. It's enjoyment on the level of the symbolic, which is to say, the ideal of American democracy, the White House, is just a dump. It doesn't meet my standards. It's not as good as the Trump White House, which, as the Trump Tower, which, let's be clear, is objectively true. Even Democrats who have worked in the White House talk about cockroaches in the offices, etc. It is a dump. It is a historical dump of immense significance. But Donald Trump's refusal to uphold the ideal of the White House and instead to say that it is a dump, while speaking the truth, is a form of symbolic destitution, an enjoyment of being able to look down upon the symbols of American democracy. And so draining the swamp is enjoyment on the level of the symbolic, which feeds into enjoyment on the level of the imaginary, the white liberal tears. And then the third category is enjoyment on the level of the real. And enjoyment on the level of the real can be seen most clearly in the infamous slogan, MAGA, Make America Great Again. This Make America Great Again doesn't fixate on any specific historical point, nor on any specific task that has to be accomplished so as to make America great. In fact, Fintan O'Toole, the Irish writer, has pointed out very eloquently recently that one of the registers that Trump adopts in his recent speeches is a kind of sadness, a kind of mourning of how America is no longer itself, no longer fun, no longer unconflicted. And therefore, the Trumpian real of enjoyment is precisely this return and the future promise of some indiscernible quality of truth or enjoyment that he will allow us to supposedly access again. And here we have the dialectical triad of the Lacanian imaginary, symbolic, and real, which is the triad of the imaginary enjoyment of the pain of the symbolic other versus the symbolic enjoyment of the desecration of the ideals of American institutionalized democracy. And finally, the real of enjoyment, which is the impossible void, if you will, of the idea of an American identity of joy and freedom and authenticity. In fact, freedom should be seen here as another example of the Lacanian real. It's not freedom to do something specific. Instead, it's the ideal of freedom as its own master signifier in which the subject, the American subject, recognizes himself as authentically American. Žižek's argument, therefore, is that Trump is an obscene master who creates a horizon against which enjoyment can once again be accessed. And in a sense, even Democrats are subject to this. The recent and very smug pleasure of Democrats in the conviction of Donald Trump is itself a kind of Trumpian politics, itself a kind of imaginary and symbolic enjoyment. Symbolic on the level that the institutions have succeeded in convicting Trump, American democracy is thriving. Imaginary on the level that Trump is supposed to be upset and angry, and he has never been so threatened, and he fears bankruptcy and jail. And finally, on the level of the real, that American democracy is about speaking the truth and protecting the rule of law. Now, Žižek's argument, before we regress into mere psychoanalyzing politics, is, of course, as I said at the beginning of the lecture, also to find the political within psychoanalysis itself. Žižek's argument is that this rise of obscene masters occurs only against the backdrop of repressed authorities. So let's lay out the argument in 60 seconds. Remember, Adorno's argument was that capitalism created fetishistic desublimation, which is to say, the superego authority was not the opposite of the id, the site of pure desire, but instead took on the guise of the id. The capitalist imperative, therefore, is enjoy yourself. This creates a deadlock for the capitalist subject, who has to who has to uphold the superego of the capitalism incentive structure so that he can enjoy by purchasing commodities. And as soon as this superego structure disappears, the subject would disappear. Therefore, capitalism has a stranglehold upon the subject who exists in a post-ideological stance of enjoyment, which can only be sustained against the horizon of capitalist participation. If you refuse to participate, you do not exist, you disappear. This means that we are nominally free and yet more and more depressed. A permissive society makes us repressed and depressed. This means that even the way in which authority is exercised upon us is no longer overt. Instead, we impose authority upon ourselves, and vice versa, and this is crucial. Figures of authority pretend to be our friends. Your boss who pretends to be one of you. The parent who pretends to be the child's best friend. This creates this repression of authority and the nominally free guise of the subject who is caught in the deadlock of desire within capitalist oppression, creates the very reactionary turn by which we stage a return of the repressed, the obscene master of the will. Figures like Trump as the obscene master who doesn't listen to the supposedly objective or neutral stance of the experts. Once again, an expert is a figure of authority hiding behind the idea of empirical truth. Instead, we have a Trumpian figure who assumes a pure nihilistic stance of pure will. It is true because I say so. It is legal because I do so. And this very nihilism is a return of the repressed. The repressed element of the superego injunction within capitalism, which creates a desire for a return to traditional figures of parental authority. Therefore, Trump is a symptom of capitalism. He is not an enemy to the existing institutional liberal democratic order. He is a direct symptom of it. He himself is a monster from the swamp. He is the return of the repressed, namely that which is repressed within liberal democratic participation within capitalism. That is Žižek's basic stance. Thank you, everybody, for staying with me for 30 minutes. It's been difficult to sustain my argument because there's a lot going on in the background, but I hope that that has been useful to you. If you'd like more condensed versions of that argument, you can also watch my 10-minute videos on YouTube that are a little bit shorter and a little bit more structured. Thank you to the patrons who continue to help me host these daily videos, even while I'm out camping and traveling. I'll be arriving in San Francisco this evening, so tomorrow the next class will be from San Francisco. Thank you for watching, and if you'd like to download my ebooks, and if you'd like to learn more about these topics, please do consider becoming a patron. Thank you so much, and I will see you guys on Discord in mere minutes. All right, talk to you soon.